Hi, you're listening to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi-weekly talk show that exclusively brings insights from the Indian space activities ecosystem. I'm your host Narayan, the co-founder of India's first space-focused think tank, Spaceport Sarabhai. Guests on the NewSpace India podcast help you understand space activities-related macro and micro trends within India in all aspects, including space history, local industry, space science, technology evolution, law and policy, art, and more. The NewSpace India podcast is supported by Dassault Systems, a global leader in providing businesses and people with collaborative virtual environments to enable sustainable innovations. Dassault Systems Solutions supports startups, small and medium-scale enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launchers and satellites. Hi, and welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Today, we have here Arvind, who is a consultant and he now runs TerraWatch Space, and it's very successful with his focus on Earth observation. I'm sure that, his background of being a software engineer and then moving into Earth observation and then now really helping companies with the go-to-market strategies and really shaping up the space industry in Earth observation as one of the, I would say, most recent pioneers in this sector would be the right word for him in that sense. So Arvind, thank you so much for taking the time to speaking with me. And I'm really excited to ask you some questions that I'm dying to listen your views on.
Sure. Thanks, Narayan. It's a pleasure to be on. And thanks for the kind words.
Great. So let's really begin with what have you seen in the Earth observation domain that you think are of interest to somebody who is either an entrepreneur or a policymaker in India in terms of trends, and where have you seen maturity or progress in this sector? Because this sector has been around for a long time. Earth observation has been around for 50 years or whatever, and it's changed incrementally, and as convergence has happened, things have narrowed. But what do you see as some of the most interesting things that people need to watch out for?
Yeah, I think as you said, it's not new, right? It's been around for 50 years. LANS was launched in the 70s and it's been collecting data for 50 years and we've been using that data. So it's not a new sector at all. But what's changing now is essentially the supply of data is increasing, both from a public sector mission point of view, but also commercial companies coming up, including companies in India like Helen, who are all also launching satellites. So there will be an increased supply of data. And also on the public sector side, we've had a couple of missions from India launch, including recently, and then I guess NISAR will come in with a partnership with NASA, which is a very interesting mission because of the kind of capabilities it will have, and it will also be open data available for everyone. So on the data side or data acquisition side, as I call it, that's the first layer. Things are great. They're collecting a lot of data. But then the challenge is then in the two following layers. The second is what I call dissemination. So how is this data being disseminated? Who is it being disseminated to? Who is using them? How are they using them? Because, using satellite imagery, as a lot of people know, requires its own expertise because it's its own science called remote sensing. So it's not every software engineer or data analyst can use that data because they need to understand. Or even if they understand, they need to know, apart from an optical image where they know it's a tree, they need to still understand remote sensing to get insights out of it. So on the dissemination side, you have things called platforms where you can either go and access imagery or you can access what is being called analysis-ready data these days. And there's also some companies focusing on edge computing, for instance, which is a combination where they're trying to kind of analyze the data in orbit. You have a couple of companies in India coming up, like Sai, which is trying to put SAR and optical together in one satellite, and SkyServe, I think, which is also looking at edge computing, on-orbit processing. So what they're trying to do, instead of disseminating the data, they're trying to disseminate some sort of analytics. So they're trying to do that. So again, companies are going in that direction, but is that enough? Are more people actually aware of which platforms can be used to use the data, download the data? That I'm not fully sure of, because it depends on policy, which, as some of them might be aware, is changing in India. We have a new geospatial policy, and there's a lot of focus on geospatial, at least in the last year or two, where there have been some policy revisions which have made either selling data or acquiring data easier. The policy has supposedly made that easier, but is that in action? We have to see. And the last kind of stage is intelligence. which are kind of companies using satellite data to create insights or create products, essentially software for use in different industries. And I think there has been some success in that, typically because India has anyway been quite successful in the software world, whether it's creating a product for energy or if it's for infrastructure monitoring, or even for use cases that are outside the usual bell curve, where you have companies like Numer 8 and you have Acco Connect, which I think raised funding recently. They've been doing pretty well, but then obviously they don't advertise themselves as satellite imagery companies because they're trying to solve their own problems. So in that front, things look good. Is that enough? I don't think it's enough because we are more than capable of, I guess, producing more companies. We should be producing more companies because we have a lot of problems to solve, whether it's simple things like monitoring the roads or having better warning systems when there are floods or creating better flood maps. So there are a lot of use cases that are there that we need support on. And we've been seeing even like recently there was the I wouldn't say debacle, but then the news from Joshimath that some folks might be aware of. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of use cases. I think that use case is more to do with landslides and how we can spot dangers well ahead of time with satellite data. So there are a lot of use cases. So we need a lot more work across a lot of sectors. But I guess the focus has been a lot on acquisition, which is the first layer, which is launching satellites and creating new data. But unfortunately, the next two layers have not been as much focused, both on the policy side, but also on the commercial side, whether you're an investor or even if you're someone who's an outsider who has no idea what's going on. That's not what you think about. You just think about the satellite, you think about the rocket, which is a bit of a pity. So yeah, that's kind of the state of play today.
I think the key message here is the three layers that you mentioned, which is data acquisition, data dissemination, and then insights and intelligence around the data itself. How do you see India and the players within India, both governmental and private, go against the trends that are happening around the world? Are we very far behind what is happening around, or what do you see as your lens of comparing these? And are we in a place where we are competitive to a large extent and we will be equally progressing in innovation and all of these things, or are we in the place where we're going to miss the...
It's a good question because I don't know if there's one general answer for across the industry, but then on the data layer, on the acquisition side, I think we're doing quite okay because obviously India is one of the best countries when it comes to observation satellites. And every time I learn about either a satellite that I've not heard about or just look into the capabilities of a sensor, I'm amazed because we have a lot of capabilities, whether it's high resolution, optical, SAR, or the satellites that we have launched in the past, partnerships with Israel, for instance, which are probably more for defense use cases. But still, we have the technology. So, we probably are not missing the bus when it comes to the data acquisition layer. Do we have as many companies as the West? We don't, but maybe it's a good thing because there is a crowd of companies from different parts of the world launching satellites without really knowing what the satellites will be used for. So in that sense, because we have these 3 or 4 companies actually, along with the public sector missions, I think we're doing pretty good because it's covering the hyperspectral side of things. And then Galaxy, when they launch, they will have a hybrid optical and SAR mix along with onboard processing. And then Satshore will have again, optical multispectral with, I think with some onboard processing as well. So on the technology front for the data acquisition side, I think we're doing good. I don't think we've missed the bus. We are investing smartly in things that we might need. I don't know if that's happening on a more strategic level. I would like to see it more happening on a strategic level, which means from a very problem-centric point of view. We are still launching from a very technology-centric point of view. I would like to see us launch with a purpose. By that, we know that India is very focused on agriculture. How are we doing in terms of coverage and imagery with respect to agriculture? I'd like to see some sort of, strategy go into before launching the next satellite, see how it's relevant for India's most important sector, agriculture, and see what are the gaps and see how we can fill the gaps. So that's something that we can do, but I think that'll inevitably happen because we will have all these satellites up. Where I guess we will have probably missed the train is mostly on the intelligence side, but I guess there are 2 sides of the coin to that. One, we will have a lot of companies in the West pushing their technology and pushing their products to us. You look at climate and you look at emissions or all of that climate related products. we will have a lot of companies from the West pushing their or trying to push or localize their solution. Or you look at a planet, I'm sure they'll start pushing their solutions into the developing world and also to India sometime in the future. But then the thing that works in our favor is we need localized solutions. We need solutions that are built for India, which I don't think can be built by someone coming from the West. Maybe they can build a satellite and offer that, but then from building a service that will be used, I don't think they can do that. Like you look at a company like Blue Sky Analytics, they have invested a lot. And of course, they are from India and they know a lot of things that folks from the West would not probably know or know how to sell or create a software product that makes sense for the Indian market. So I guess we are not missing the train there because we still are the ones who will be capable of doing it. I'm afraid if it's going to be too late, someone else is going to come into the market and learn, how the industry works. And it's better if, it sprouts from India and kind of expands into the world. And Thatcher is a good example of a company that has done that. But I'd like to see Thatcher, if I think about like successful in quote unquote, but companies that have made it, there are not many in India, but for such a large software and service oriented market, I don't think we've produced as much. So yeah, I think that's where I fear we might miss the train, even though we still have our localized solution. Like I said, that is going to be important. And that's very few coming from the outside will be able to do. But I fear that they will inevitably do it if we don't do it ourselves. And for that, we need to do a lot of work, right? Whether it's coming from education, we need to set up an ecosystem. How many people who are studying data science or the millions of people who are studying computer science, how many of them know even that, petabytes of data are available for their use? Or do they know the basics of remote sensing and how to use the data? Do they know what the use cases are? Or if you're someone who's starting a software company, which I guess there are thousands of companies being founded on a daily basis in India, how many of them actually know what satellite data can do? Maybe there are some that take that for granted, but then you need to know that when you're founding the company in order to exploit that. And I know of some companies that are coming up that are actively thinking about it, and I've had conversations with them, which is great. And they're trying to sell it to the national authorities or their state authorities in smart city management, water quality and water pollution. So there are a lot of these companies coming up that are starting companies centered on solving problems using satellite data, but I don't think we have enough. We need to invest a lot more on awareness and education, but also couple that with having tools, right? Just because someone knows, because that I can do. I'm creating a course and I want to go and push that in India, I can do it. But then if we don't have the follow-up for that, which is basically an interesting platform where people can go and play around and create their applications, then that's a problem. Or if we have to depend on a company that is building it for the US market, that is a very different problem. It's better if we have things like that coming out of India. So I think we need to couple the awareness with proper actionable tools that people can go to. It seems even if we were to spread the awareness, I don't know if we have the next step sorted out, right? Do people know where to go and buy satellite data? Do we have a portal where we can go and access all potentially available data from all of ISRO's missions? Those are all a question mark, right? So I think all of that also need to be coupled with the awareness part.
Great. And one of the interesting aspects here is the question of government being a customer in the satellite industry and in the Earth observation industry. There is this hope that space and even Earth observation will be commercial to a large extent, and government and especially defense and other such requirements that come up mostly from governments eventually will be lesser and the commercial world will take over in terms of the demand curve, right? I don't know if we are already there, or I don't get a sense that we are already there. I don't track those numbers personally a lot, but my sense is that we are nowhere close to that kind of break-even point to a large extent in this industry. And it may be that we can never be as well, depending on the geopolitical situations that arises as well, and the maturity of the industry as well. So there's been hope for the Earth observation community for the last many decades as it is. So there is this sense of Earth observation in India, and especially a lot of the downstream applications can run with mostly private or B2B or even B2C applications. How much of that is a reality today, and is it a good expectation to have? Or is government needed as an anchor customer in some of the specific areas for many of these companies to pitch them as a customer to be able to mature?
Yeah, it's a good question because, obviously it's not a given. And I think the answer depends on for what use case, to be honest, because there are some use cases where I think the demand will inevitably come from the private sector, where there will be a proper product market fit or a technology market fit where we know that satellite data will probably be the best technology, not just because it can do it, but it's the most scalable and efficient way to do it. I'm talking use cases related to climate risk reporting, and all of those climate related disclosures that companies need to do, as well as things that they need to do to take care of their assets, build early warning systems so that they don't lose their infrastructure to a weather event. Things like that will inevitably come. You don't really need the government to set the precedence for that, where the companies will themselves go in the hunt for solutions because they know that they don't want to have their assets destroyed in the next flood. And they want to either even some of the companies, not specifically in India, but then there are some companies I'm speaking about in the West that are even ready to make their own investment into improving a part of the technology if it's saving their bottom line. Because if the solution is not available, they're even ready to invest in their own to create those solutions. So on those use cases front, I'm not really worried because there are some use cases for which satellites are the best way to do it. And I think you just need to do some sort of matchmaking. And the best use case I can think of is what Stature is now doing in India across with banks for credit scores and all that. Inevitably, all of them will figure out that, we are not going to go into each house or look into each farm to verify if they are qualified for a loan or they have a good credit score. You can just do it from satellites because it's just scalable. You can sit at home and look at a dashboard. So, it's just those use cases, they'll just inevitably, the adoption will happen. But then there are some use cases where, especially on the public sector side and related to policy monitoring, where you need to have the government buy in. I'm thinking of use cases where the policy related aspects or economic aspects, even where you think about, I mentioned an example about water quality monitoring. There are going to be very few companies who are going to be interested in doing that on their own, right? Or if it's, urban development or looking into green spaces or even looking into emissions, for instance, or reporting emissions, carbon stock takes and things like that. There, the adoption will not happen. And even though there's a startup now today that can provide a water quality monitoring service to everybody, or, potentially even expand that to other use cases, right? This is the best place to build the infrastructure. Or if you're setting up a new, building, or you're building a new stadium, or you're investing in a major infrastructure, this is the best place for it because you can see from the flood map and from the elevation model that this is where floods will not occur. Things like that. I would expect the governments to come and set the stage and also set the context for private companies. From like what happened in the West, you need to have some buy-in from the government to show that this is a valid technology and we're going to use it for making serious decisions. And if that happens, I think the adoption in the private sector will follow. And on the defense side, I think it's a completely different conversation, right? So the adoption of commercial imagery by the defense sector is an ongoing conversation. It started to happen in the US. The biggest validation came last year with a big contract from the DoD, the 10-year, $10 billion contract, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe the numbers are wrong, but we got that validation and there will continue to be such big contracts. That's great news. And that's kind of how it's happening in the West. So for defense, that's a completely different conversation. But then for commercial use cases, civilian use cases, I feel like there are some where the government needs to kind of show, maybe in some use cases, they don't even need to adopt as much as the private sector will, but then they need to at least show how it's done. And I feel like if we don't have that, then it's going to be hard for the private sector to take that risk and go into investing in a new technology. In some use cases where they have to, they will. But I don't think we can just depend on that automatic adoption. We still need the government to show how it's done because a lot of use cases, let's face it, are going to be very similar. Whether you're reporting emissions, the governments need to do that. Whether you're reporting the risk or you're developing new flood warning systems, all of that the government will have to do anyway. So I expect them to kind of set the stage there, which has not happened as much as I would like, to be honest.
Yeah, and one of the other aspects that you actually touched upon is this idea that localized solutions to India will come from local people because they understand the problem and the culture very well. And this is an interesting aspect to discuss as well, which is if you look at enterprise SaaS in India or so on, there's a number of companies that have gone on to create software products that sell around the world. Companies like Freshworks and Zoho are really great examples of something like that. And putting together this reverse logic, how easy is that for companies like Satchor or others to capture markets are abroad? Because that should also be equally difficult, right? Because at the end of the day, in any sector that is very high touch, and space and earth observation and all of these sectors are extremely high touch industries where you need to be very close to your customer to do the discovery and identify all the gaps and then create a service or an intelligence or insights or whatever you want to call it, then to be able to solve a particular problem. What is your sense of this sector? Will it be a bunch of companies who are sitting close to their customers in each of the regions that are then moving ahead, or is there a possibility for Zoho style or Freshworks style capturing of global markets by certain enterprises or certain companies?
Yeah, 100%. I think that can happen. And I think, again, if you were to look into it with the lens of the three layers, even with the acquisition, the data layer, right? Like it is going to be inevitable that we will start manufacturing satellites at scale. Today, if you want to buy a satellite, and you know that better working at or working, being part of the executive team at Search, you know how these acquisitions happen. If a country wants to buy new satellites, this is kind of how it works. But then it will happen, it's probably a matter of time before India becomes competitive on launching satellites. So if some country or a company wants to launch EO satellites, they will inevitably find out that, okay, you know what, we have a few capabilities in India that are very cost efficient that will do the job. So on the upstream satellite selling front, I think it can inevitably happen, especially with a few companies coming up. And the same applies to the data side, because they will be able to launch satellites and manufacture them at scale at low costs compared to the West. I think that will affect their pricing as well. And we saw that with Statlogic's pricing supposedly seemed to be one of the cheapest for even pretty high resolution, like 70 centimeter imagery. And I think we can see that. I'm guessing that's kind of where Pixel will probably position itself, because there are several hyperspectral companies coming up in the world. And even though Pixel has other differentiating factors, I expect them to also differentiate by price. So because of their design that is done in-house and their ability to potentially also manufacture the whole thing in-house, including the payloads, again, which doesn't happen now, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that from the data pricing side, we can be competitive and we can go and expand to a global market. And at the end of the day, because I work with end users, I know that they care mostly about the price. So they wouldn't care where you're from unless it's for a defense use case, where the data is coming from or where the company is based. So from a data point of view, it's easy to imagine that world quite late in the Earth observation kind of cycle, because there are companies with already pretty operational constellations. So we might need to execute pretty well and efficiently to get to that stage. So yeah, that's on the data side. But then on the dissemination and the intelligence side, we have the potential. And I don't think it's wrong to say that we will have our own kind of Zoho or Freshworks company, simply because the use cases that we are targeting are quite localized. We may need to identify a use case that is applicable globally in the same way as we are. The thing with, for example, Zoho is it's a very horizontal company. So they can look at selling their success or CRM essentially across the world, because everywhere it works the way it works the same. I'm wondering what would be that horizontal use case for satellite imagery. We can look at a platform. If you look at a platform company, I think that makes sense, because everybody would want to access the data, play around with it, and you can think of everybody wanting it in the same way. But then if you're going down the value chain into a use case, it's going to be quite hard to imagine, because you look at, for example, Blue Sky Analytics, which is generating data sets like wildfire and emission and water quality and all that. I don't know if they will be consumed in the same way. It will be reported the same way around the world. So they can potentially do that. It's not a no, but then identifying that horizontal area, which is scalable globally, is going to be a challenge. But that's not to say that companies will only just remain in India. And you look at Thatcher as an example, they are already selling their products in a few countries. And I expect a lot of them, of course, in the developing world, because we have similar cultures and localized needs. So I expect companies to do that and then slowly but surely expand into the West. So I can think of kind of this Earth observation industry growing in 2 or 3 kind of ways around the world. The West will have its own ways and own companies and expansion strategies, and then companies coming from India and let's say the larger Asian continent scaling one way or the other, and then there's going to be the Chinese ecosystem, which is going to go and develop on its own. So growing in the direction, that's how it is right now, because even in China, their industry is pretty big, and there are several of these companies and several companies launching satellites. So China has its own ecosystem, the West has its own ecosystem, and I think for some use cases, there might be companies from the West trying to sell their products in India, especially if it's coupled with the big tech or with the big enterprise softwares of the world, right? Like if there is SAP, or if there is, I don't know, Accenture that is developing a new solution for vegetation monitoring, it can be scaled globally. It doesn't matter where that solution is developed. But then there's going to be some use cases where it's going to be separate for India and the developing world.
So one of the other interesting aspect is this idea of how do you productize Earth observation? Because I guess a lot of pitfalls in the Earth observation community is really people who fall into the trap of just becoming either consulting companies or doing projects instead of products or services to a large extent that are repeatable, right, in one form or the other. How much of this industry today, in your perception, is really a place where they are looked at like any other enterprise product rather than just consulting or project-based business?
Oh, yeah, but that's a challenge that not just in India, but around the world, it's the same thing. We have more consulting, service-based, solution-based companies in Earth observation, more so than scalable or companies with scalable and repeatable business models, which is just the nature of the industry, because you're also early days in the commercial sense. It's not early days for generating the data, but then it's still early days for the commercial and go-to-market side of the industry. Even companies that are sitting on millions of dollars of cash like Planet are figuring it out as we speak, whether it's through their go-to-market or their acquisition, they're still figuring it out. So I don't think it's just not an Indian thing, but then obviously I guess we will have our own kind of way of implementing it. And I have kind of it's not the truth yet, it's not a fact, but I have a thesis that the adoption of Earth observation is in India and in the developing world will be in a way that is different to how it is in the West. Meaning we will be able to adopt it in a way that the countries in the West have not been able to do for several reasons. But we've already started to see that happen, for example, with Thatcher and how they've been able to sell to the biggest banks in India, for instance, or the way Blue Sky has been able to do it, or EchoConnect, the names, the usual suspects from Indian GEO ecosystem keep coming up because they have pulled it off and they have convinced these large even banks or governmental agencies to adopt this new type of data, and they've started to use it operationally, right? And in the West, that same process has taken a long time for several reasons, whether it's their willingness to use the new technology, etc. And the equivalent that I can think of is how Africa got into the mobile payments before the West did, because they were just able to adopt it quickly than the West could. I'm guessing something similar will happen in the Indian and the developing ecosystem in terms of adoption of data, simply because the necessity is also going to be high. Because you look at even in Africa and across, I'm guessing it also can be generalized across Asia and Latin America, the needs will define how the technology is adopted. And because the needs and companies will probably see the benefit, right? Like at the end of the day, it's numbers. Why should I use satellite imagery for monitoring my infrastructure? Why should I use it for verifying credit risk scores? Things like that. The companies here will start to see the advantage of satellite data faster than companies in the West will, because they already have a traditional way of working. You look at insurance has had a way of working in the US and in the West in one way, and they would find it harder, slower to change their strategy and start using satellite data, etc. But then in India and other developing world, I expect that to be faster because they're going to realize that soon, simply because they didn't have a stable traditional model. Their traditional model was very bespoke and hit and miss. And now if you have a solution that is scalable and that works and hopefully is cost efficient, they're going to just adopt it. So I expect that to be pretty good in India, but then it won't happen by itself. We need to enable that and make it happen. And that involves creating all these companies and investing in all these companies and creating an ecosystem for creating new companies like that can inevitably solve some of the larger economic challenges. And I think we are also very well equipped to do that, because my thesis for Earth observation is if you're starting a company, you shouldn't just think of just satellite data or just space or anything like that. You should just think of solving a problem. And if that involves combining 5 types of data for 5 different customers in 5 different ways, we need to do that. And I think we are ready to do that because that's what we've been doing within our software ecosystem anyway. And that's how we have founded all these companies, because we have thought of localized ways to solve our problems and we have gone ahead and solved it. And I think I don't expect any less than what happened in that for Earth observation. But yeah, obviously it's still a thesis and it's not a fact yet.
Yeah, always interesting, some of these kinds of aspects. And the other really interesting aspect is really the participation of big tech in Earth observation and the impact on India and even maybe the rest of the world as well. Because one of the things that is happening, maybe the space industry and the generic community within Earth observation is too small and too little capital to invest into developments of real AI, I would say, to a large extent, and the kind of infrastructure and the investment that is needed to advance the adoption of AI kind of technologies into this field. And interestingly, I saw actually a video from a demo that Google did a few weeks ago in India, where they have now digitized land and farms and they're starting to digitize a lot of the natural resources and everything else. And they're going to implement their AI engine, I think, on top of all of this imagery that is already existing and so on. I wonder what would be the role of these kinds of companies once they step in, and how much of that will cause a disruption to a large extent. And if that could be this layer where everything in terms of the processing abilities and the processing requirements and being able to really go into, a no-code solution of intelligence would emerge from all of these kinds of advancements, and how that would impact a lot of the businesses that exist who are operating in a niche that still serves with a lot of manual work and not this level of implementation of such an advanced technology. What's your views on these?
Yeah, this is exactly falling under the category of solutions or approaches that will be developed for India, either by the big tech or by entrepreneurs within the country. But I think we will have localized solutions because the uptake and the adoption of this is going to be high. I expect the use of satellite data also to increase, because now we've got a big push from Google to enable that. And similarly, it is, of course, investing in its capacity, and it's also having satellite data in their platform on the cloud. Same with Google, with the Google Earth Engine. And I expect them to also realize the potential of the market, simply because of just the scale. At the end of the day, it's a numbers game. Yes, it's about the contract size, but then for some use cases, it's also about how many people are using it that will then lead to more projects. And you can totally see Google looking into Google Earth Engine. Right now, Google's focus for Google Earth Engine, which is its own satellite data processing platform, has been on the West. And they are figuring out their commercial model. They are even figuring out their features. And I expect them to do a specific product for India and in the Indian ecosystem in general as the demand for data picks up. Because, if they don't do it, they will lose out. On the AI front, I think there is some synergies that are starting to occur with respect to AI and satellite imagery. Like you said, there has been very kind of different conversations or separate conversations on AI and how AI is going to change things, whether it's through like the text-based interfaces or it's whether through the visual mediums. And I think inevitably the visual medium will converge with the satellite imagery front, because folks who are working on computer vision, whether they are working in pharmaceutical or where they're working in industry, manufacturing industry, will start seeing the parallels that if you're in the industry and manufacturing and your algorithm to look at a specific part of your component or train them what or how to hold the object and things like that, it will have kind of spillover effects in Earth observation because that's what we're trying to do anyway, right? Like it's a car, it's a building, and we will start seeing those synergies and we will have companies that will be founded. And what I want to see happen is these synergies to happen not by accident, but in kind of a planned way, right? If there is a company that is building a computer vision algorithm, and I know of a company, and I think it's called Hyperverge, that kind of went through this evolution, and I want to see a lot more companies go into it and not end up accidentally into satellite imagery. We want to enable that by strategy, because if someone is developing an AI model for doing something that has some overlaps with how we're looking at it in satellite imagery, or even with respect to larger data science, a lot of weather models today, the numerical weather prediction models, are using traditional data science and machine learning techniques. So we want to be able to see parallels, and we want to be able to see both from a fundamental level. So if you're a researcher who's at a university trying to do it, you want to be able to see the parallels. And of course, you're excited about the new big technology like AI, but you should be able to see the parallels and its applications in satellite imagery. And that's where I guess the awareness part becomes more interesting and important.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the aspects that I'm always interested to look at is this idea of innovation hubs in Earth observation, and you can identify them in different parts of the world, right? There you go to the UK and you have the satellite applications catapult, and there's an interesting startup, a geospatial ecosystem created by Geovation also in the UK, and there's a few other places like that, right? And this is something at the moment that is largely missing in India, where really the discovery of the problem and the stakeholder analysis, as well as the working with the stakeholders and everything, can accelerate through such a platform. What is your sense of if obviously India should have a geospatial innovation or a startup accelerator kind of a program? And if yes, what that structure of that program would look like?
Yeah, we should absolutely have them, because it's not going to happen by accident. Like the synergies that I'm talking about are for an ag tech company to realize that they should be using satellite data, or if you're an insurance, whoever, fintech, whatever you're starting to look. Of course, there will be a curious founder with some background in science, or someone would have known, or someone would have told them that they can use satellites. That's how they're using satellites today. It's not happening organically or structurally. I think creating these innovation ecosystems or hubs or whatever you want to call it is absolutely necessary, because it's not going to happen by accident, because it's two different kind of ways, right? If you're someone who is head of ag incubator, or if you have an insurtech accelerator program, yeah, you have no incentive to think about space or satellite imagery or the use of it. Probably not now. Maybe in 5 years, 10 years, when satellite imagery is mainstream, you will inevitably use that. But today, you need to make that happen. And I think like the satellite applications catapult model needs to be replicated. I think there's a lot of scope for that, simply because you need a place where innovation can meet, of course, the space agency. So ISRO has probably a role to play there, but also the investing community, and the last one being the end user. So we need a kind of an ecosystem where we can have these people meet up, maybe a little bit more than matchmaking, and there needs to be some strategy thinking to establishing it. And to be honest, one of the things that I want to do, hopefully sometime in the next few years, is to create something like that, because we don't have enough of them in the world. And what I want to do essentially is what you're talking about here, is to create a way for these things to happen, because the conducting competitions and hackathons will only get you so far, right? Like the ones who are very interested in playing with satellite imagery will attend and perhaps found a company or two, but that's almost believing in kind of that people will figure out new ideas and create companies that people will want to buy products from, which is almost like how, to be honest, how the European innovation has been going on today. There's very little structure. Even in the US, there's not been much, but I think that's starting to change now with all the accelerators, and especially with the focus on defense over there. But I think for India, we need to have that, especially by sector or by use case, right? Like we need to have that innovation ecosystem also by geography, right? There may be parts of India that are very good, and I can't think of the top of my head, but you probably know, I can't think of an example where this part of this part of India is very, very good for churning out insurtech companies, fintech companies. Of course, we have the Bangalore where everything is, but I feel like there are some localized specialty areas where we can approach with specific use cases and how satellite data can play a role so that you don't have to go and barrage them with all the information of this and this and these are the sensors. You can have a very specific innovation creating model where you know that this area or this part of or this hub already exists for energy or for insurance or for other sector, and you can then create kind of an ecosystem around that. I think that would be the way to go, and I don't think we have that today. I think it probably needs to come top down, right? It probably needs to come from the government and probably from ISRO, but also I guess there may be a chance for some investors who are interested in specific markets to start doing that. I'm thinking about like the Antlers, the world that are interested in setting up these innovation ecosystems to start thinking about it strategically.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things that I was trying to do in some of my recent trips is really have just information sessions or exchange sessions with people who are from end user communities. For example, we had this setting in mind where we would invite the top 5 real estate companies in India to just come and talk about the challenges in their business, and not really to talk about anything with respect to space or satellites or anything like that, but generally for them to talk about what kind of information can make them more effective or efficient, or what kind of gaps they see in having a much more competitive environment in that sector. And all of these is where you get a lot of the signal around where does business value come from. And the other bit is really, I think, to a large extent, that is really missing this network of, I would almost call it like a mentor first adopter network, where if you take the top agricultural companies in the country, or the top energy company, or the top energy, whatever the sectors they are, and you pick the top 25 executives in 25 companies there, and them being able to work with or have a relationship with what the Earth observation community is doing is extremely important for the adoption of those things or those tools that these guys are creating in those sectors, right? Because it's a two-way conversation that needs to happen. And often either somebody is pushing a solution where that solution is not needed, or somebody has no clue what exactly is going on and are making some assumptions to create something which doesn't work eventually. Or if you create something, then eventually you figure out that nobody wants to buy this at this price and it'll fall through in any case. So I think a lot of this can happen once you combine this effect of having an accelerator or a thing like that and include a really strong, this kind of a mentor and adopter network.
Yeah, 100%. I think the important thing is to also not, the thing that I don't like or started to dislike is giving them the accelerator label, because they probably are not even accelerating. They're just finding product market fit, which should happen like when you're founding the company. So they probably need to, that's more of a branding, labeling exercise. But essentially, we also need folks, and I think it's probably just the government for now, where we need ones that have no skin in the game or no stake. So if you want to be doing this so that the only goal is not value creation or it's not, but that can happen as a side effect. As a side effect, you can find investor, you can find your next unicorn, or if you're a customer, you can find your next kind of supplier for a product. But doing this in a way that is not going to be sided in one way or the other, because that would then lead to kind of some sort of a pressure that, we need to invest in 2 out of 10 companies that we invited, which is not going to work, right? You want to be able to do that in a very open way. And I think it's also going to be helpful for startups. But yeah, I think we need to think about it more in terms of how to make that happen.
Okay, like final question, we're running out of time for sure. What are your, let's say, top list of advice or even top things with respect to recommendations that you would like to see or provide that will have an effect, let's say 5 to 7 years from now, that are specific to Earth observation in India?
Yeah, I think probably three things. One is on the entrepreneurial side in terms of creating new companies. I don't think we have enough, to be honest. Maybe we have enough satellite companies, but even there, we have a couple of them. But I think that it's changing, it's growing. We have, I think we just saw Galaxy raise their seed round, if I'm not mistaken, or was it pre-seed? I don't remember, but they did raise a new round. So there is some traction among investors. It's definitely not growing. Sorry, it's definitely not enough, but I think it's growing. So we need a lot more. And I think this innovation kind of ecosystem would enable the creation of those. So in order to make that happen, I think we need more of a top-down approach. So the recommendation is probably to start thinking about ways to set up these top-down but strategically focused innovation hubs that would result in the creation of companies or even just the validation of ideas with end users, with the satellite companies in terms of what would be the best thing to happen. Because what we don't want is just one company founded because of the will of an entrepreneur or just because of even an accident. That's not what we want, because we can't pride ourselves if that happens. So that's the first thing in terms of creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Second thing is more the awareness. I think that's a long-term game because it's not going to change. It involves changing things in university to what people are exposed to, in terms of also how we are reporting about satellite imagery, because I would be very happy if none of the satellite imagery providers or companies are associated with space, because I have come to the conclusion that it doesn't work, and it only lets people think about something that is not there. So I'd rather that be associated with software than space, because that is closer to the customer. Of course, the data comes from satellites and coming from space, but I'd rather not be associated. So on the awareness spreading front, I think I want to focus on that a little bit more, because India has its own kind of evolution in the space tech ecosystem. Of course, we are going to have a lot of, or at least a couple more private launchers. We're going to have several satellite manufacturing companies. We're going to have potentially, or the first human space flight mission, and maybe side effects and spillovers of that. So there's a whole revolution in space tech. Let's not include Earth observation and satellite imagery into that. That would be one. It's probably counterintuitive, but I think it helps from an adoption standpoint. And the last thing is more on how we make ourselves available and how our companies are thinking about it. Because I would want India to be kind of, it's a weird to say, but then we were the software powerhouse of the world, or we still are, but we're still losing that and the market is not growing as much as it should. But we can take over the onus of the geospatial powerhouse, which, to be honest, we already have quite a lot of capabilities, but we can think about it strategically, or the companies in India can think about it strategically to become the geospatial powerhouse, because a lot of companies here in the West are going to want to build solutions. Some will buy off the shelf, but then quite a few of them will want to build their own customized solutions. And I don't know if we have enough capacity in India to be ready for all the work that can come in. So from a company point of view, like the corporate, I'm talking about the big Wipros and TCS and the HCLs of the world, they are probably thinking about it in a very fragmented way. But I would probably encourage a lot of them and recommend all of them. And I think it's also a function of how we do the awareness and how ISRO sets up the strategy and how the government adoption happens. But I also like them to see some strategic focus on it, because there is definitely a way to go there, because there is going to be a need for these geospatial powerhouse companies that can build geospatial enabled software solutions. And guess what? These companies already do a very good job of building software. They just need to integrate satellite data into it, and they need to think about it strategically. Yeah, those are the three that come to mind.
So, Praveen, thank you so much for spending the time with me and talking about a lot of these things, and good luck with all the things that you're doing. And I'm sure that there's tons to do with respect to this industry, and there's a lot of progress that needs to happen. And part of that, I hope that will come from a lot of the companies and a lot of products that will come out of India as well. So thank you so much for spending this time, and see you soon.
Thanks, Narayan. It was a pleasure. Yeah, it was a great conversation. Thanks for having me on. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening in to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share this episode with anyone you believe will enjoy listening to it. You'll be able to find the NewSpace India podcast in any of the podcasting platforms that you may be using, including Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and others. Do subscribe to the podcast in case you want to receive new episodes automatically. I'm grateful if you're able to leave a rating for the podcast, which will help others discover it. Thank you for listening in again, and the next episode will be out in the next 2 weeks as usual.